This morning, Batya, Robby, and I gave our predictions for the new year, but we also think it's worth taking a look back at 2022 and discussing the highlights. So, Robby, what were your top moments?
Well, I think the big story this year has to have been the red wave that wasn't. The Republicans really underperforming midterm expectations, taking the House by a much narrower margin than anticipated, and then failing to take the Senate. In fact, the Democrats improved their standing in the Senate. It was the big political story. So the polls were not all that off. Honestly, most of these races were within the margin of error. I think Arizona was much more solidly blue than perhaps even the polls expected. But other than that, everything was there were no big surprises. But the pundits had gotten way over their skis, especially on the conservative side, in predicting just this blowout. Not only, saying that they were going to pick up they were going to hold Pennsylvania, pick up Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and then people were talking about what about New Hampshire? What about Wisconsin? Ones that were really kind of well outside their reach, and they came short of everything. So that was a big political story that I think should have prompted some reflection from Republicans and conservatives. Why are they not, even in a cycle that should have been very favorable to their side, with the economy not doing terrific, with a lot of even bipartisan frustration with Joe Biden, why couldn't they deliver it? And my explanation being that they just cannot lean into the election stuff, the kind of bow down to Trump and pretend he actually won. That just turns off the moderate, normie Democratic voters. Just will not go for that message. Mm-hmm. So that would be one lesson. The other lesson being pay attention to whatever Ron DeSantis did in Florida, because clearly that's working, whereas the rest of the party has some soul searching to do. My other big story of the year was COVID, not entirely disappearing from the news cycle, but it's I think worth remarking on how much less we talk about COVID, even on our show, on a daily basis than we did a year ago. A year ago, when I was sitting in this chair with Ryan Grimm, Kim Iverson joining us remotely. We have some different faces in the mix now, but we were talking about COVID several times a day, and that was broadly true across the media. So it's a good thing, obviously, that we're not having to talk about the pandemic with such frequency. I remember thinking a year and 2 years ago, when will be that day where we wake up and don't think about COVID? And it's that day occurred. We passed it at some point with very little fanfare. So just wanted to take a moment to celebrate that the demise of the horrible, miserable thing.
For better or for worse, there's an argument that we should be talking about COVID because it hasn't actually gone away. People are heading, have just come back from the holiday season. We'll see if there's any kind of resurgence. Some people are predicting it. But I think the lack of coverage reflects a lack of a feeling, rather, that there's not really any response that is kind of publicly palatable, or is the politicians that we have are willing to frankly fund. So any conversation that we used to have about improving air quality, no one's talking about that anymore. Biden just restarted the initiative to send free tests to families who make requests online, but that had been paused for months, with the presumption being that COVID was basically over. Maybe that was more of a midterm stance than an authentic belief, but we'll see if there's any resurgence of that in the new year. But Batya, what are your biggest moments of 2022?
I think I would have to say, the war in Ukraine, I think, was really the thing that I think when we look back on 2022 will stay with me, will stay with a lot of people, both in terms of how it reoriented foreign policy conversations but also the domestic conversation. I think it really laid bare a lot of the tensions between the elites who set our foreign policy and what average Americans want and need. And so I'm hoping that is the lesson people take from this. Also, just, I really have I really find compelling the narrative that our response to this is very much driven by how the Democrats perceived Putin's role in getting Trump elected. I really think that that's an important part here. And I think that, a lot of people need to speak up and critique more how that has reshaped our internal politics because of the huge domestic price that was paid for the endless support for this war and the refusal to pressure both sides to come to a negotiated end to it. The other story I'm going to say I think was a really big deal. It didn't get as much press, but I think the CHIPS Act was really presaged a new era of reshoring manufacturing that is going to be, I hope, embraced by both sides. I mean, that is the future. We need to get back to an economy that's based on production. That's where all the upward mobility for the working classes, that's where all the upward mobility for racial minorities is. And I think that that is extremely important. And it was just so heartening to see how much energy there is for that on both sides of the aisle. Reshoring manufacturing, getting back to a place where we have a strong, empowered, upwardly mobile, middle-class living working class. That seems to me to be a huge priority, and it was great to see real energy there this year. What about you, Briahna? What are you looking back at?
Yeah, for me, I got to say, I don't mean to be Debbie Downer here, but it was a lot of disappointment for the left, not necessarily unexpected for those of us who didn't meet Joe Biden yesterday, but it was really a lot of disappointments from the elected progressives, who I think a lot of folks still held in relatively high esteem and expected better from. They really showed their full hand this year. Most recently, we had the vote almost unanimously among squad members and progressives to squash the railroad strike just a few weeks ago. Signed by Joe Biden, called for by Joe Biden, who could have sat it out, of course, allow the workers to strike, not enforce that regressive 1920s Railroad Act that takes from them the ability that all other working class union members have to actually use their leverage and go on strike for at least one vacation day. Of course, we had the CPC letter where a couple of progressives got together and said that they might tentatively say, please, can we have some peace? And they got slapped down by the Democratic Party establishment, completely thrown under the bus. And that gave a lot of people not so much hope in the idea that the anti-war movement really has a home on the left altogether. Joe Biden, after making some pretty big promises about canceling student debt, went about it in the absolute worst way, relying on legislation that was very flimsy, would fall apart under a legal challenge, which is likely the case. We'll see what the Supreme Court ultimately says. But many student debt advocates, said from the jump that Joe Biden should sign an executive order immediately canceling all student debt and then clawing back money that was a windfall for undeserving people, wealthy people, through taxes. But the way he went about it basically set himself up for the kind of legal challenges that are likely to restrict everyone from getting any student debt relief, which means that he flat out lied to the people of Georgia and others who basically won that state for him in 2020 and won the election for him overall because of those kinds of promises. You saw Roe v. Wade being a big issue in midterms. We'll see if there's any real legislative movement on that from Democrats as well. And finally, the biggest moments, I think, were a whole slew of shootings that are so numerous that it was hard for me to recall them all and put them in a row. Obviously, we had the Q nightclub most recently that is related to the animus and public conversation around drag shows that resulted in the death of 5 people. There was the Buffalo grocery store shooting that resulted in the deaths of nearly a dozen African Americans. That was a targeted racial shooting. There was the Uvalde shooting, which of course resulted in the deaths of so many innocent young children and also showed shined a real spotlight on police incompetence, which I think is another big story this year where the mood has really shifted, especially on the right, away from the kind of complete and total trust, faith, and confidence that folks once held in the police force as more folks from different backgrounds are exposed to the ways in which they don't often actually hold up their end of the bargain, public bargain, and do the work of solving crimes and bringing people to justice as opposed to creating more chaos and standing by while kids are getting shot.
The Uvalde story really does stand out in my mind, just in terms of the sheer incompetence that was. We have so much documentation of it, so much evidence of it, so much video footage of it. I mean, the images of the police standing in the hallway are just seared into your mind of them, arresting parents outside the school, trying to stop parents who are trying to get in to desperately rescue their kids. I don't know that I agree. So on the right, there is a lot of suspicion of sort of national law enforcement.
Abolish
Absolutely.
the FBI.
100. I would say the Republicans are the party of opposition to the deep state, or the FBI, the CIA, Department of Homeland Security. I don't think that extends down to just normal policing, cops on the street. Republicans, I think, are still very supportive of that. And Democrats may be even more supportive of that than they were a couple years ago. But
I don't know. There's been always some bipartisan support around police reform in terms of people concerned about the cost of mass incarceration. There's been some bipartisan support of moves to end qualified immunity. We just covered the story of Daniel Shaver. There were some recent developments in his case and settlements and the like, the man who was so tragically gunned down, defenseless in a hallway by cops. And I think folks seeing different kinds of people, including white people, being so abused by the police, I've noticed a tone shift, whereas before you could see the most heinous crime committed by a police officer and there would be endless numbers of defenders. And now there's more of a discussion of, okay, there are bad apples. We've got to address the bad apples. I don't have an unqualified support for the police as an institution. And I think this FBI stuff, there's some trickle over effect from that as well. So look, we'll see. These are predictions of sorts. We'll see what happens going into the new year and if these trends continue. But I loved all of your predictions. We'll have more Rising for you after this.